The 80s film canon has calcified around the same few blockbusters. These are the crime thrillers that didn't, even though they were doing something far more dangerous and compelling, disappearing into obscurity before quietly proving their worth years later. Dennis Hopper called David Lynch after reading the Blue Velvet script and insisted he had to play Frank Booth because, in his own words, he was Frank Booth. Hopper was attempting a comeback after years of being blacklisted due to drug addiction, drawing directly from his experiences to create one of the most terrifying performances in cinema history. Jeffrey Beaumont discovers a severed ear in a field, pulling him into a voyeuristic nightmare involving Dorothy Valens, a lounge singer terrorized by Frank. Lynch weaponizes the artificiality of suburban perfection, using exaggerated Technicolor blues and reds to create a world that feels like a fever dream. The film treats violence as theatrical performance, with Frank's gas-huffing ritual functioning like backstage preparation before he terrorizes Dorothy. Lynch's contrasting sound design, alternating between dead silence and Roy Orbison's swooning ballads, creates sensory whiplash that makes the audience complicit in Jeffrey's voyeurism. The gamble resurrected Hopper's career and proved Lynch could transform personal volatility into unbearably intense cinema. Stanley Kubrick called director George Sluizer to tell him The Vanishing was the most terrifying film he had ever seen, even more so than The Shining, an endorsement that became the film's most powerful marketing tool. The story follows Rex, whose girlfriend Saskia disappears at a French gas station, leaving him to spend 3 years obsessed with her fate until Raymond Learn, a seemingly ordinary family man, calmly admits to being the kidnapper and offers a chilling deal. Sluizer refuses to give the audience any catharsis, treating the kidnapper not as a movie monster, but as a man performing a scientific experiment on human morality. The film's structure deliberately shows Raymond's mundane preparation. His practice runs with chloroform timing and trunk measurements, transforming horror into banal logistics that make the crime feel sickeningly achievable. Sluizer uses long static takes during Raymond's confession scenes, forcing the audience to sit with his sociopathic explanations without the relief of editing or music cues. The original ending left test audiences in shock, and when Hollywood made a remake, the studio added a fight scene and happy ending the film's director later disliked. Peter O'Toole stayed in character as the godlike director Eli Cross throughout the Stuntman production, maintaining his performance as a ruthless, manipulative puppet master, even when cameras weren't rolling. Behavior, cast, and crew described as beautifully unhinged. The story follows Cameron, a Vietnam veteran on the run who accidentally causes the death of a movie stuntman and gets offered a deal by the eccentric director to take the dead man's place, pulling him into a surreal world where the lines between staged accidents and real-life peril become indistinguishable. Richard Rush's direction deconstructs the nature of cinema itself, questioning whether the camera captures reality or creates it, with every scene leaving you uncertain whether what you're watching is part of the movie within the movie or actual danger. Rush spent 9 years trying to get the film made after studios repeatedly rejected the meta-narrative script as too complex. Despite being one of the most critically acclaimed films of 1980, 20th Century Fox dumped it into a handful of theaters with virtually no advertising, leading to a quick death at the box office followed by 3 Oscar nominations the studio barely capitalized on. Legendary director Hal Ashby was fired from 8 Million Ways to Die and locked out of the editing room 2 weeks after shooting, with the production company seizing the negative after becoming horrified by his hangout style of filming that lacked a cohesive narrative. The story follows Matt Scudder, an alcoholic sheriff's deputy whose career ends in disgrace after he kills a suspect, only to work as a private investigator when approached by a call girl named Sunny who wants to get out of the business, leading him into a dangerous game with a charismatic drug kingpin. The production chaos was tragic because Ashby was reportedly so uncooperative that he wouldn't provide finished script pages, forcing Jeff Bridges and Rosanna Arquette to improvise dialogue minutes before cameras rolled. The studio hired a new editor to salvage the film, resulting in a disjointed final product that Ashby tried to disown, effectively ending his career as he died just 2 years later. Produced on an $18 million budget, the film grossed a mere $1.3 million in its entire domestic run, making it one of the biggest bombs of the decade and forcing the production company into bankruptcy. The Coen brothers spent a year raising $750,000 from 65 private investors by creating a 2-minute trailer for a movie they hadn't even filmed yet, using a friend and a piece of meat to simulate a body being dragged. They pitched it as a guaranteed moneymaker in the vein of slasher films, despite intending to make a sophisticated noir, a bait-and-switch that became legendary in independent cinema. A wealthy bar owner hires a sleazy private investigator to kill his wife and her lover. But the plan goes sideways when the investigator decides to double-cross his employer for a bigger payday. The Coens used the noir genre to explore miscommunication and paranoia, with none of the characters truly knowing what the others are doing, creating a bloody comedy of errors where every attempt to cover up a crime only makes things worse. The low budget forced creative solutions, shooting in actual Texas locations that gave the film its rain-soaked, neon-lit atmosphere that feels suffocating and claustrophobic. When the film grossed $3.8 million, nearly 5 times its budget, those investors saw a massive return, and the Coens were instantly established as the new kings of independent film. Christopher Walken transformed his entire physical presence for The Dead Zone to depict a man whose psychic powers are literally draining the life out of him, creating one of his most human performances. The story follows Johnny Smith, a teacher who wakes from a coma to discover his fiancée has moved on, but he's gained a terrifying psychic ability to see tragedies by touching people, ultimately facing a moral dilemma when he meets Greg Stilson, a rising politician whose future he sees triggering a nuclear apocalypse. David Cronenberg transforms Stephen King's horror premise into a deeply melancholic tragedy about a man who loses everything twice, first in the accident and again when he realizes he must sacrifice himself to prevent a greater evil. Cronenberg shoots the psychic visions using harsh white light and quick cuts that feel like violent intrusions, making Johnny's gift look more like seizures than supernatural insight. The film's political prescience comes from treating Stilson not as a cartoonish villain, but as a populist demagogue who manipulates working-class resentment, a characterization frequently cited in political commentary for decades. Jeff Bridges filmed 2 versions of nearly every scene in Jagged Edge, one where he played Jack Forrester as genuinely innocent and one where he played him as a hidden sociopath, refusing to tell Glenn Close which version he was doing during her close-ups to elicit a genuine, confused reaction. The story follows San Francisco heiress Paige Forrester, who's brutally murdered in her beach house, with her husband Jack as the prime suspect, leading him to hire high-powered defense attorney Teddy Barnes, who finds herself falling in love with her charismatic client while receiving anonymous typed notes that hint at his guilt. What makes the film's structure so effective is how it traps the audience in the same psychological prison as Teddy, forcing us to question whether we're watching a love story or a manipulation, with every piece of evidence cutting both ways. This method approach created a real-life sense of distrust on the set, with producers worried Bridges was being too unlikable, but he ignored the notes, believing the tension was essential. The calculated performance is what makes the ending so impactful, with audiences genuinely split on Jack's guilt until the final seconds. The film grossed over $40 million domestically against a $15 million budget, launching a wave of erotic legal thrillers that would dominate the late 80s and early 90s. Abel Ferrara cast 17-year-old Zoe Tamerlis as the lead in Ms. 45, then shot largely unpermitted on the gritty streets of 1980s New York City, with cast and crew often running from police. The story follows Thana, a mute seamstress who was subjected to 2 horrific sexual assaults in a single day, shattering her mind and leading her to keep her second attacker's pistol and begin wandering the streets at night, initially targeting men who harass her, but spiraling into a generalized hatred of all men. Ferrara turns exploitation cinema into a genuinely disturbing character study, using the visual language of grindhouse films to explore urban isolation and the cycle of violence without ever feeling gratuitous. The film uses Thana's muteness as a formal constraint, forcing the narrative to function entirely through visual storytelling and ambient street noise, creating an oppressive sonic landscape where every catcall and car horn feels threatening. Ferrara's guerrilla shooting style captures the actual danger of Manhattan's garment district, with real pedestrians wandering through frame and genuine street harassment bleeding into the fictional narrative. The film found a massive following in the midnight movie circuit, establishing Ferrara as a major voice in American independent cinema. Anthony Perkins channeled his Norman Bates legacy into playing an even more depraved religious psychopath in Crimes of Passion, carrying a razor-sharp phallic weapon that the crew infamously dubbed the murder dildo. The story follows Joanna Crane, a high-fashion designer by day, who transforms into China Blue by night, an expensive prostitute specializing in elaborate fantasies, only to be stalked by Reverend Peter Shane, who believes it's his divine mission to save her soul or destroy her body. Ken Russell weaponizes the visual excess of 80s cinema to critique religious hypocrisy and sexual repression, creating a neon-lit fever dream that feels like a punk rock assault on Reagan-era morality. Russell shoots Joanna's transformation sequences like religious rituals, with costume changes functioning as sacraments and client fantasies treated as confessions, inverting Catholic iconography to suggest sex work as spiritual labor. The film's deliberately theatrical violence, particularly the murder weapon's phallic absurdity, turns masculine aggression into grotesque comedy that exposes the sexual panic underlying religious fundamentalism. Kathleen Turner nearly derailed her career by taking this role, fighting the studio when they gutted the film's provocative scenes, though the unrated video version became a massive underground hit. Roman Polanski refused to use stunt doubles for Frantic's most dangerous sequences, with both he and Harrison Ford actually climbing onto a steep, rain-slicked Parisian roof to work out shots where Ford's character crosses the ledge with no digital effects and minimal safety rigging. The story follows Dr. Richard Walker, an American cardiologist whose wife Sandra disappears from their hotel room during a Paris trip, forcing him to investigate on his own with the help of Michelle, a street-smart young woman involved in the drug trade. Polanski uses the language barrier and bureaucratic indifference to create a suffocating sense of isolation, with Walker trapped in a city that refuses to help him while the clock ticks down. Polanski shoots Paris not as romanticized tourist destination, but as a labyrinth of hostile architecture and impenetrable social codes, using long takes in cramped hotel rooms and narrow streets to trap Walker in increasingly claustrophobic spaces. The film's deliberate pacing, moving from paranoid thriller to violent espionage plot, mirrors Walker's psychological descent from rational professional to desperate vigilante. Polanski brought personal grief about his wife's murder to material that transforms a standard thriller into a meditation on loss. Harrison Ford was determined to prove he could lead a prestige drama after years playing space adventurers and Witness, anchoring a film that uses the contrast between urban violence and rural pacifism to create unbearable tension. The story follows Detective John Book, who realizes the killers of a murder witnessed by a young Amish boy are corrupt cops within his own department, forcing him to flee to their secluded community where a forbidden romance blossoms with the boy's widowed mother Rachel. Peter Weir shoots the Amish sequences with natural light and wide static frames that emphasize communal labor, then disrupts that visual language with handheld chaos when violence invades. The famous barn-raising sequence functions as visual counterpoint to urban construction, using real carpenters and actual wood joinery to show a society built on mutual aid rather than individual ambition. The production faced hostility from the National Committee for Amish Religious Freedom, forcing Weir to cast professional actors instead of using real community members. When Paramount screened the film, they feared it was too slow, but it grossed over $116 million worldwide. Abel Ferrara hired real-life street people and actual club denizens as extras for Fear City, creating a set that was frequently on the verge of real violence, with the guerrilla-style production capturing the neon-lit decay of pre-gentrification Manhattan. The story follows Matt Rossi, a former boxer haunted by a tragedy in the ring, who runs a high-end entertainment agency providing strippers to elite clubs, only to have his business threatened when a psychopathic serial killer using martial arts begins targeting the dancers. Ferrara uses the visual language of exploitation cinema to document a vanished New York, shooting actual 42nd Street locations with their peep shows, grimy clubs, and street violence as both setting and character. Ferrara's cinematography bathes everything in saturated neon reds and blues that turn the urban landscape into a hellish nightscape, with the killer's naked martial arts katas functioning as perverse ballet against the city's commercial sex trade. The film treats violence not as cathartic action, but as economic disruption, with each murder threatening the financial ecosystem supporting hundreds of working-class people. The studio, 20th Century Fox, became so disgusted by the graphic content that they sold the film to an independent distributor, dumping it into grindhouse theaters where it became a cult hit. Jodie Foster auditioned multiple times for The Accused, despite being a former child star, with producers wanting a more conventionally sexy actress, until Foster showed up in character to prove she could embody the working-class vulnerability of Sarah Tobias. The story follows Sarah, who is brutally gang-raped in a bar, while onlookers cheer them on, only to feel betrayed when the prosecutor allows the perpetrators to plead guilty to a lesser charge, pushing her to go after the solicitors who encouraged the crime. The film shifted the legal conversation from the act itself to the complicity of bystanders, forcing a courtroom confrontation that challenged societal victim blaming in ways mainstream cinema had never attempted. Director Jonathan Kaplan uses handheld cameras and long takes during the assault flashback to trap the audience in Sarah's perspective, refusing to cut away or soften the horror. The film's structure deliberately delays showing the assault until the trial, forcing viewers to question their assumptions about Sarah's credibility before confronting the truth.